welcome everyone to the first MA Parent Education Series event of the year. We know that you're all very busy, and we are grateful to you for coming out tonight to hear Dr. Pekel from the Search Institute. This is Dr. Pekel's second visit to MA. Kent was actually here with us last spring for a conversation about developmental relationships, the importance of non-parent adults in your child's life, and how to encourage them in Who's in Your Teen's Village. Tonight, Kent is with us to present his current work at Search Institute on perseverance. Every parent and community leader here tonight has puzzled over how to help a child find their own personal drive, interest, or desire to achieve. It's tricky. We find ourselves suggesting, coaching, pushing, modeling, nagging, and dragging youth toward a path to purpose. But fortunately, a growing body of research demonstrates that when schools, youth programs, and families act intentionally to influence motivation and persistence, it's possible to significantly increase both qualities. To help bridge the gap between the worlds of research and practice, Search is offering a new resource called the Perserverance process. The process distills the research on motivation and persistence into a set of actionable strategies. Kent will share Search's approach with us tonight. Kent Pekel, Ed.D., is an educator who has worked at the school, district, state, federal, and university levels. His passion is translating powerful but often complex research into practical solutions for schools, youth programs, and communities. Since joining Search Institute in 2012, Dr. Pekel has given audiences across the country thought-provoking updates on Search's new research on developmental relationships. Kent holds a BA in East Asian Studies from Yale University, a master's in education from Harvard, and a doctorate in education from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kent Pekel.
Thank you very much. So, Search Institute has been around about half a century. I've been there 2 years, and our mission is translating research into practical solutions. One of the things I usually forget to say before a presentation, and then somebody I notice in the audience is like hurriedly writing down everything that I'm saying. These slides will be available on our website for those of you who actually want to go deeper or who want to share them with your school or youth program or organization. In some ways, PowerPoint has been the death of interesting conversations, I think. But this is an actual slide from a presentation at NASA in the 1950s. So that's actually how they used to present information. So PowerPoint has its place, but I hope tonight will not be death by PowerPoint for all of you. This is fun because a lot of the time I do this with schools. I've been a teacher, I've been an administrator at both the school and the district level. As I mentioned at the outset, the parenting perspective we think is really, really critical. And as I thought about this discussion tonight, I thought back on an op-ed that I read in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was last summer or the summer before that. And it was a writer who was writing about her daughter's tendency to quit when things got tough and get frustrated. And here's how she ended her op-ed, and I thought it was a good jumping off point for our discussion tonight. She said, "I understand all too well that our time with Neva will pass faster than we think. One day she'll venture out into the world, training wheels off with all the hills and valleys of life ahead of her. When she hits that inevitable pothole, rather than sitting down and weeping in defeat, I hope that we will have taught her how to get right back up, hit the pedals, and climb." So I think for all of you who are here thinking about your kids, that is really what we're thinking about with perseverance. I think it's really important to say at the outset that in our work on perseverance, we're talking about students who are struggling in school, and we're also talking about students who are succeeding in school, but not taking risks and not pushing themselves into new areas. And so this is a challenge that presents itself across a lot of different experiences. In some ways, we could sort of think about the challenge with this picture. For a long time in the United States in particular, we've kind of thought that students came with batteries included or not. And the kids who came with batteries included and they loved school got put on the college prep track, and they were on that pathway to some kind of a four-year institution, and the kids who didn't were put onto different pathways. The challenge today is that we've got to get all kids to high levels of academic learning. And so when kids don't sort of come with batteries included for working hard in school, how do we actually help them get those batteries in place? So I used to be a social studies teacher. This is a very inside baseball joke for people in the room who are educators. People say, what is the most common first name of a high school social studies teacher in the United States? It's Coach. That's a very social studies joke. But I started teaching in the days of film strips, and social studies teachers, actually I think it's as important a subject as exists, but social studies teachers are sort of famous for turning on the video and turning down the lights, so in good fashion I'm going to actually start with a video here. It's a video that some of you may have seen, and it's a short clip from a TED Talk, but the reason I'm showing it is, there are two reasons. Number one, the presenter has got a much better accent than I've got, and if I could imitate his accent, I would do the whole presentation in his accent tonight. But the main reason is because in the video that he shows of young children about perseverance, there is one girl who, if you haven't seen this video, you will never forget. And if you forget everything else we do for the next hour, I predict you'll remember her and you'll know who she is. So if we can start that video off, this will get us into the discussion of perseverance.
I'm here because I have a very important message. I think we have found the most important factor for success. And it was found close to here, Stanford. Psychology professor took kids that were 4 years old and put them in a room all by themselves. And he would tell the child, a 4-year-old kid, Johnny, I'm going to leave you here with a marshmallow for 15 minutes. If after I come back, this marshmallow is here, you will get another one. So you will have two. To tell a 4-year-old kid to wait 15 minutes for something that they like is equivalent to tell us, we'll bring you coffee in 2 hours. Exact equivalent. So, what happened when the professor left the room? As soon as the door closed, 2 out of 3 ate the marshmallow. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes. Some lasted 14 and a half minutes. Couldn't do it. Could not wait. What's interesting is that 1 out of 3 would look at the marshmallow and go like this. Would look at it, put it back. They would walk around. They would play with their skirts and pants. That child already at 4 understood the most important principle for success, which is the ability to delay gratification. Self-discipline, the most important factor for success. 15 years later, 14, 15 years later, follow-up study. What did they find? They went to look for these kids who were now 18 and 19, and they found that 100% of the children that had not eaten the marshmallow were successful. They had good grades, they were doing wonderful, they were happy, they had their plans, they had good relationships with the teachers, students, they were doing fine. A great percentage of the kids that ate the marshmallow, they were in trouble. They did not make it to the university, they had bad grades, some of them dropped out, a few were still there with bad grades, a few had good grades. I had a question in my mind. Would Hispanic kids react the same way as the American kids? So I went to Colombia, and I reproduced the experiment, and it was very funny. I used 4, 5, and 6 years old kids. And let me show you what happened.
Hasta para un niño de 4 años, es atractiva la idea de tener el 100% de retorno a la inversión en 15 minutos. Sin embargo, algunos de ellos, tan pronto la puerta se cerró, se comieron el marshmallow inmediatamente. Otros, en cambio, resistieron el impulso.
What happened in Colombia? Hispanic kids, 2 out of 3 ate the marshmallow, 1 out of 3 did not. This little girl was interesting. She ate the inside of the marshmallow. In other words, she wanted us to think that she had not eaten it, so she would get 2, but she ate it. So we know she'll be successful, but we have to watch her. Okay? She should not go into banking, for example, or work in a cash register, but she will be successful. And this applies for everything, even in sales. The salesperson that customer says, I want that, and say, okay, here you are. The person ate the marshmallow. If the salesperson said, wait a second, let me ask you a few questions to see if this is a good choice, then you sell a lot more. So this has applications in all walks of life. I end with the Koreans did this. You know what? This is so good. We want a marshmallow book for children. And we did one for children, and now it's all over Korea. They're teaching these kids exactly this principle, and we need to learn that principle here in the States because we have a big debt. We're eating more marshmallows than we're producing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, obviously you figured out which girl I was talking about, I would assume. So let me actually jump off from Korea, because actually the reference to Korea is pretty telling. Because international competition is one of the reasons that researchers and practitioners and parents are increasingly focused on this idea of perseverance. So let me take a little bit of a detour through some economics and education here internationally to make the points that we're going to get into around perseverance. This is high school graduation rates as measured internationally. So it's not the same percentages you would see here in California or in any US state today, but it was measured using a common denominator across countries. And I know it's hard to see probably from the back of the auditorium, but you can see in the 1960s, the United States is clearly the world leader in high school completion rates. In fact, we were the first country to make 12 years of elementary and secondary education universal. And there's a growing body of economic research that suggests that more than our natural resources, more than immigration, more than a lot of other things, it was the fact that we made education a universal fact of life before any other developed country that played a big role in our economic success in the 20th century. So it's 1960s and the US is clearly number 1. 1970s, with the yellow colored bars, we made a little bit of progress, but you can see that actually there were a couple other countries that leapt ahead in that decade. For those of us in the room who remember it, the most ominous was the one that here says the Russian Federation, at the time said the USSR. It was the years of the Cold War. In the 1980s, we can see that the US had a flat decade, and we're now one of several countries that are at the top of the world internationally in terms of high school graduation rates. We had a flat decade again in the 1990s, and now we're simply in the top tier. Over the course of those 4 decades, the US went from being number 1 to number 13 in high school graduation rates. And back to the end of the video with the little girl eating the marshmallow, Korea went from being number 27 to number 1. Now, a lot of things obviously happened in Korea besides what they might be referring to with the marshmallow. First of all, they started from an extremely low starting point, devastated by something called the Korean War. But there's a growing sense that the investment that kids put into learning is part of what is producing those results, not just in East Asian countries like South Korea, but in countries like Finland and elsewhere around the world. So the first thing that brings us to this focus on perseverance is this interesting, though not entirely clear, international picture. Second is a changing economy. We could spend the whole night on this picture and everyone would leave the room except me, but it basically maps out what has happened in the US economy in terms of the mix of jobs over the same time period that I just showed you high school graduation rates. And you can see that in 1960, and these are 2 economists, one at Harvard and one at MIT, who took a look at the broad mix of skills in the economy, we were pretty evenly balanced between jobs you did with your head and jobs you did with your hands in the 1960s. By the early 2000s, we can see that routine manual jobs, jobs that actually you're going to do in the sort of mustard-colored line with your muscles that are routine and repeated, are declining. And jobs that are non-routine, analytic, and non-routine interactive, whether that's a computer programmer or an architect, are in the increase. So there's a fundamental change, and probably most of you in this room are pretty aware of this. I would suggest that there's probably a lot of our fellow adults and most kids are not aware that there's this fundamental sea change going on in terms of the skill mix that it takes to succeed in the economy. So what have we done about that? We have raised standards a lot. And for most of us, especially who have kids in high school and who then probably went to high school in the 70s or 80s or even 90s, we may not be quite as aware as is helpful of how much we have raised standards academically since we were in school. Here is, and I did not pick a low-lying item. Here is a test item, here's a test item from the state test in Massachusetts. I picked Massachusetts as pretty much our educational leader in the US, from the early 1980s on their basic skills test. And you can take a look at it there. So you see, you didn't have to solve the problem. You had to know what you needed to do to solve the problem. Here, again, on this example too, I did not pick an outlier. This is an item from the 6th grade math test in Massachusetts in 2011. There's always about a third of the room that starts to laugh when that comes. And I don't know if it's because it's the mathematician saying, that's easy, or people thank God I don't have to solve that. Or both. So those two items represent the fact that we have had a quantum leap in what we're expecting kids to do academically in school over the last 4 decades. And the basic premise that we have at Search Institute is that we are not going to get all kids to that high level of knowledge and skills simply by telling them not to eat the marshmallow. That deferring gratification is part of the puzzle. It's part of the solution. Because resisting impulses and temptations is part of what it takes to succeed in life. But I picked that picture as the other end of the spectrum. That's right before Hurricane Sandy. And my wife and I actually were in DC and got the last plane back to Minnesota before Hurricane Sandy hit. That's at the Tomb of the Unknowns in Arlington Cemetery. As far as I know, those guys stayed out there the whole hurricane. There were a lot more factors than the ability to resist the marshmallow that went into their ability and their decision to stand post there in that symbolic but very important setting. And so the question then that I think a lot of us are grappling with is, what are the factors that go into that level of perseverance? A level of perseverance that is about a higher commitment, about an investment in yourself, about an investment in family, about an investment in your community. And at Search Institute, and this is very much a work in progress, and I would be surprised if somebody doesn't come up to me after this presentation and say, you've got one of the letters wrong. We're trying to summarize this in an acronym. And the acronym that we're using is STICK to it. And it is spelled out for you on the document that you are the first audience in the country, group in the country, to get this very drafty draft of what we're thinking about with the perseverance process. It's an effort to look at the broad research around perseverance and try and put the pieces together into a package that adds up to a deeper level to persevere through difficulty and distraction to achieve goals for our purposes, first in school and educationally, but we think beyond that as well. So the framework, as you'll see, is outlined on that document, starts with something we call sparks. Those are the passions that ignite kids' interests, helping identify those intrinsic interests in their lives that animate, make them want to get up in the morning, and helping them think about, well, if I am willing to work hard at this, what is it going to take to work hard educationally? Getting the tasks right that kids are assigned at home and at school, making sure kids think about the nature of intelligence in ways that research is showing have powerful implications for their motivation, creating a sense of community, both within school and beyond it, kindness and caring, the interpersonal aspects of motivation, the importance of those aspects cannot be overstated. Helping kids think about thinking, practice what we'd call metacognition, that when kids cannot step back or, like if you use a movie metaphor, do a screenshot above their heads and think, am I understanding this? They're going to really struggle persevering through challenging content. Solving obstacles and working through points where kids get challenged to the point where they don't shut down or turn backward. getting the incentives right, and then finally working through transitions. The research is pretty clear that at a moment of transition, and some of the biggies are elementary to middle school, middle to high school to higher ed, but there's lots of others. Those are moments when kids form new perceptions of the way things are done here, in my school, in my classroom, at my college, in my community. And so transitions are moments to invest really, really heavily in motivation. So some of you may be thinking, does this mean I have to do like all of the STICK, TOIT? And in some ways the answer is yes, but I just really wanted an excuse to show this picture. Lions pretend to be hurt by the bites of their young to encourage them. So if they do that, you can do stick to it over time. So actually tonight really is a walkthrough of the components of the perseverance process. By January, all of the components that we're going to talk about now in very rapid fashion will be on our Parent Further website, which is parentfurther.com, which is a website we maintain for parents that will have practical how-to activities, videos, and strategies that will help you do the various aspects of Stick to It. So in some ways I apologize for the fact that this is a bit of a teaser for those resources, but hopefully we're giving you enough ideas tonight that you'll be able to actually do something long before January. But we will be putting on Parent Further, it'll be a completely redesigned website focused on material like the kind we're going to talk about tonight. Very briefly, I need to say something that's pretty important, because there's a lot of discussion about grit and motivation today in thinking about kids. And it's really important to note that even if you as parents do everything right, if our schools don't also change their approach to motivation and persistence, we're not going to get where we need to go. So I chose that picture because it represents a practice that is deeply ingrained in American educational culture and history, which is class rank. And there's a million other practices I could pick out, like grading on a curve, that essentially motivate kids by ranking them. And the research today would suggest this is in fact about one of the worst things we could do. If you look at those kids up there who maybe are at number 1 and number 23, ranking kids might be motivational for the kids in that 1 to 23, but what does this approach to motivation do for the kid who is number 147 or number 218? The big lesson from those changing lines and graphs that I showed you a moment ago with Korea and other countries is that we're only going to succeed educationally and economically if we get all kids to high levels. So that if schools continue to essentially treat motivation as something that kids come into the door with or without, and there's not much investment in the academic motivation of kids who don't seem to gravitate toward working hard in school, everything you do as parents and everything the kids do themselves is not going to succeed. But that's not really what we're focused on today. So the good news is the discussion is changing, because the research is increasingly showing that this stuff is not fluff, that these soft skills are not just sort of dispensable soft skills. In fact, a recent study found that character skills, specifically perseverance, conscientiousness, sociability, and curiosity, rival IQ in predicting educational attainment, market success, health, and criminality. That's from James Heckman and one of his colleagues at the University of Chicago, and Heckman won a Nobel Prize for his early work on human capital. And so we're not out here talking about fluffy stuff that you should ignore and really focus just on the math scores or the English scores. That it's showing up increasingly in the research that this is as determinative of your children's future outcomes as some of the academic stuff that we've been worried about for a long time. So this stuff is complex, but it's not that complex. Which is, why does that happen all the time? So one more conceptual point, and then we're going to jump into a small subset of the Stick to It framework and give you some thoughts about that, and then we'll open it for your questions and thoughts. Why does it seem to be possible increasingly to not take character skills or strengths as character traits? Historically, we've seen these things as fixed, like somebody's personality. And increasingly in the research, we're seeing that, in fact, these are not traits, they're malleable. They're things that can change. And in a moment, as we walk through several parts of the Stick to It framework, you're going to see that not just psychologists, but also economists and other researchers are increasingly demonstrating that these things are not etched in stone. and that we can change them. And of course, there's a million reasons why that's true, but I want to just sort of highlight one basic principle that hopefully you can keep in mind, not just for this discussion, but afterward. And that's that every kid, your son, your daughter, if you're a teacher, every kid in your classroom has a tape playing in their head. And that tape is telling them basically two things: who I am and how the world is. Now, how the world is can have a million manifestations: how my family is, what learning is, what my community is, and who I am can be expressed in a million different ways. But that pretty much invariably, kids interpret the world through those two lenses. And that unless we're aware of what those lenses are, we're not going to be able to reach kids. But very hopefully, we're finding through this research that you can really help kids reframe the lens that they see the world through or themselves through. And that in fact, if we do sometimes shockingly simple things to help kids think about the world differently, from that point forward, they will view the world differently, and then, here's the key point, subsequent experience will further confirm their new lens. So in the experiments that we're going to talk about for the rest of the time here, some psychologists or economists or behavioral scientists of some type come in and they do some sort of a novel experiment, and they get this interesting outcome, interesting enough that I'm going to tell you about it. And it sort of suggests that things got better. Sometimes they do experiments to prove that things got worse. I'll tell you about one of those. And then you say, well, why did that happen? And I think the simplest way to think about that is it reframed one of those two things, or both: how I see myself and how I see the world. And when we've reframed that for a kid, it's not simple and it's not immediately done, but that the things that happen to that young person after that reframing generally confirm the new frame. And that's what gets the sort of snowball rolling down the hill in a good sense, that subsequent experience leads to other momentum. So, of these various parts of Stick to It, what we're going to talk about here tonight, and it's simply because we have limited time, and on your sheet, I tried to get it into a single column, because I know you don't have much time to spend reading about this stuff. We're going to talk about tasks. We're going to talk about intelligence, community, obstacles, and incentives. So those are the pieces. And that's not because kindness, thinking, and transitions aren't really, really important. It's simply because we'd be here all night and we got to move at a good pace to get through the other parts that we're going to get to. Now, if I were you sitting there on a parent night that I show up and somebody was telling me there's STICKTOIT, I might be saying, how do I, bite this off with my son, my daughter, or whoever you're here thinking about tonight? I think the key thing is to think about, all right, what's my lever? Where do I begin? You don't have to begin, nor should you begin, with all of these. The good news is that actually they're linked. And if you start investing in sparks, or investing in intelligence, or investing in community, or investing in caring, and kindness, you aren't going to magically get to the other components, but momentum builds. So I think there's one thing, if you leave here tonight with nothing else saying, I'm going to think about this aspect of motivation and perseverance for my son, daughter, or other young person you're here to think about, we will have succeeded. So with that, let's talk a little bit about tasks. By tasks, I'm thinking in particular of learning tasks, the stuff we ask kids to do to succeed in school. And for those of you who, like me, have been through some kind of training and education, this guy and this picture may be kind of familiar. But in fact, his insights, which are now a century old, seem to be confirmed by current research more and more. His name was Lev Vygotsky, and he was a Russian psychologist, and he did a lot of other stuff. But the basic insight about tasks that I wanted to share with you was this one. And it goes by this very wonky name, the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is the green. And it expresses a very simple but pretty profound truth, which says that if the tasks a kid is assigned, a learner actually in general, are too challenging or too easy, not only learning won't take place because motivation will be insufficient, because the kid is either going to be uninterested in investing in the work because they decide it's not important, or they're not going to do it because they think it's simply too hard. The zone of proximal development is learning that the kid can do with guidance. And so the question I would suggest for you to be thinking about is my son or daughter being given tasks that he or she can do with guidance? They're not out of the ballpark difficult, and they're definitely not too challenging. We could talk all night about what makes for engaging tasks in that green zone of proximal development, but I decided to pick on my one pet peeve. Now, some of you here may be teachers or may have loved word finds, but I would ask anybody to tell me, especially at the high school level, this is an actual high school assignment, what skill is being taught by asking kids to find those words, cumulus, in a word find? That is done to kids all the time. And it's busy work. And if you're giving that kind of busy work to kids, you're out of that zone of proximal development, because that's not work that the kid... Now, if the kid is a little kid learning to read or do letter recognition, I could see a reason for word finds. And I don't mean to, like, word finds are not the greatest evil in education, but it's a symbol of a kind of learning that as a parent you should be thinking a lot about in terms of those tasks. So the first big point about tasks is it in the zone? Is it actually something the kid can do with guidance? The second big thing is, are we giving the kids choice? One of the biggest other conclusions of the research in psychology is that whenever we mandate an outcome, whenever we give kids no choice in the class or the task, we pay a motivational price. So you can do that in the Army, but when we try and do that actually with learning and the decisions that kids make about school, we're very, very unlikely to get deep motivation and investment in learning. A counterexample, though, is an idea that some of you may have heard about that two researchers articulated about 3 years ago called a nudge. So one is a behavioral economist and one's a legal scholar. And in their view, a nudge is a pretty simple idea that can really radically change the way you work with your son or daughter about school, or if you're a teacher, the way you teach your class. And it simply says this: we're going to actually give kids choice, but we're going to give them a limited number of choices, because the research is also pretty clear that too much choice is the enemy of good decisions, especially for adolescents who don't have the brain development to process too much choice. So we're going to give them a limited number of choices. We're going to assure that all the choices are good choices, which seems kind of obvious, but it wasn't that long ago when we let kids choose classes that simply led to no positive outcome after high school. So we're going to actually make sure all the choices are good choices. But the nudge is this: we're going to make the best choice the most obvious one, or even the default. So let me give you two examples of nudges from the literature before I give you one more from education. This is a famous psychology experiment that happened at Yale in the 1960s. And what they did was they put a random assignment of groups of the senior class into two groups, and they put them in an auditorium and they gave them a lecture. And the lecture was about tetanus. And it was about the evils of tetanus, the challenges of tetanus, which was a big problem at that time, and the health problems that would occur if you got tetanus. And then the call to action was to go to the health services and get a tetanus shot. That was the simple request. So in the first group that heard the lecture, and again these were both randomly assigned to the two groups, the first group simply heard the lecture and then was told to go to the health services, and that was it. The second group, after the lecture, was given a map and was asked to draw the route from their dorm to the health service that they were going to take in order to go get the tetanus shot, and to write on the sheet the date and time that they were going to plan to go get the shot. In the first group, 3% went and got the tetanus shot. In the second group, 28% went. It's not a majority, but it's almost a tenfold increase, and that's a nudge. A push, but not a mandate, to move in another direction. So let me give you one other nudge. It's not sort of about higher education and like bigger disease. That's about half of you will recognize what that is. It actually, of course, is a men's urinal. And as it turns out, in the world of managing restrooms in large public facilities, the technical term for a major problem in men's restrooms is spillage. This is totally true. And in the Amsterdam airport, about 15 years ago, through some quirk of fate, the facilities manager was an economist with a PhD, and they decided to do a very finely calibrated experiment that resulted in a very interesting example of a nudge. First, they carefully measured for spillage across the urinals of the airport. And then in the nudge, they painted a fly on a random sample of the urinals. Then they measured spillage after painting the fly on the urinals. This nudge reduced spillage by 80%. I think proving that, I don't know if it says more about the male psychology, or I think we all need a goal to aim for, or, so quickly turning to education, they have found in similar experiments that actually when they change the order in which they put food in a school cafeteria, or the level at which they put the food, they can raise the ingredients that are taken up or down by 25%. Similarly, other nudges have happened where they have actually asked kids to identify the date and time they're going to do homework, or not asked them to identify the date and time to do homework, and it's dramatically gone up. So the big insight about tasks, again we're in that category of tasks, is number one, it needs to be in the zone. It's not too challenging, but it's not too easy. And number two, the kid needs to have some autonomy, some agency, some decision making in that effort. Intelligence. We are so close to Stanford and sort of the holy grail of the work on intelligence that I'm going to go very quickly through this because some of you may have heard about it, but then again there's always this idea that where you're closest to home you haven't dealt very much with that work. This is most associated with a researcher at Stanford named Carol Dweck, but there's a lot of others who've been doing this work as well. And she put together, in 2006, a book, Mindset, that if you haven't read, it's a really good read. It's intended for a really diverse audience. And I'll talk very briefly here about the insights that that research has given us about the importance of kids' ideas about intelligence and their perseverance. But first, I actually want to pull a quote out of the dustbin of educational history that is actually really indicative about why Dweck's work is so revolutionary. And this is from a psychologist, another one. This guy was at Michigan 100 years ago, W.B. Pillsbury. And I pulled an article from Scientific Monthly, but he was one of the leading educational psychologists of the 20th century. And I would suggest, and a lot of people would agree, his ideas are very much still with us. Here's what he described the American educational system as. And pay attention here to what this says about kids' intelligence. We can picture the educational system as having a very important function as a selecting agency, a means of selecting the men of best intelligence from the deficient and mediocre. All are poured into the system at the bottom. The incapable are soon rejected or drop out after repeating various grades and pass into the ranks of unskilled labor. The more intelligent who are to be clerical workers pass into the high school. The most intelligent enter the universities, whence they are selected for the professions. First of all, it's the men of best intelligence, you notice. But really fundamentally, the job of schools here is not to develop the intelligence of all kids. It's to look for intelligence by some measure when it walks in the door. And this is deep in our schools. Just think about the phrase college material, which a lot of us are, really implies that college is encoded in the DNA of some kids and not others. And this vision of intelligence really is very, very fixed, that some kids have it and some kids don't. So along comes Carol Dweck, and others, but especially Carol Dweck, who says, no, actually, let's think about that differently. When kids have a fixed mindset and perceive intelligence just like W.A. Pillsbury said it was, some kids have it, some kids don't. The kids who don't have it could do whatever they wanted, but they couldn't get that much smarter. That gives leads to one level of motivation in school and elsewhere. But kids who have a growth mindset, kids who believe that their intelligence is not fixed, but that in fact they can get smarter with effort, have another kind of motivation and effort in school. And what Dweck and others have proven through a whole array of experiments, which are now so familiar that at least in education circles, people kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, I've heard about growth mindset. But the question I would pose is, are we doing it at the classroom level and at the school level? So in a nutshell, a fixed mindset is saying that, you can learn new stuff, but you can't change IQ. You can't change your foundational intelligence. With a growth mindset, we might say, actually, in fact, it's never done. You can always substantially change how intelligent you are. And this research grew out of very careful observation of kids and looking at how they approach challenges and trying to understand what was going on. Again, remember that idea of the mental models that are playing in kids' heads all the time. So let's take a couple of very familiar phrases from sort of American cultural life. And they're actually emphasizing growth mindsets. And let's try and flip them here. A growth mindset saying might be, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So think for a minute, what might the fixed mindset version of that be? So the growth mindset, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Fixed mindset version, maybe nothing ventured, nothing lost. Let's try one more. If this was a smaller group, I'd be making you do this, but I'm trying to keep us at a clip. If at first you don't succeed, try again. A familiar thing that probably a lot of us heard. Definitely a growth mindset idea. Fixed mindset? If at first you don't succeed, you probably don't have the ability. The key insight here is that when a kid with a growth mindset makes a mistake or encounters a difficulty or gets a low grade or doesn't get into the college or gets the wrong class, they interpret it as an opportunity to work harder, to learn new strategies, and to get better. The kid who has a fixed mindset is going to interpret it as confirmation of my limited intelligence. And therefore, it's demotivating. Why try? Why do that to myself? And one of the things that we're seeing is that unintentionally, a lot of the way we praise kids encourages a fixed mindset. When a kid does something and we say, wow, you got the right answer really fast, we're encouraging the fixed mindset, as opposed to, wow, you worked at that a really long time, and I think that you used a really good strategy to succeed. So there's a zillion things that happen around fixed and growth mindset. And in some ways, Dweck's research wouldn't be as interesting if it seemed to simply identify some people are one and other people are the other. But the thing that's very cool about it is that the research shows we can move kids from a fixed to a growth mindset. And this is where we get into that positive side of the perseverance process. One of the most powerful metaphors that Dweck and others have found for this is that the brain is like a muscle. And I will tell you, I've done this with, I think now, hundreds of kids. Kids intuitively understand this because you can say, how many of you play a sport? How many of you exercise? How many of you dance? How many of you run? When you lift, when you run, you break down the muscle fibers, and what happens to them? They grow back stronger. Even little kids understand that. What's cool is that when we tell kids that when they challenge themselves, that mental activity literally creates both more and stronger connections in the brain, they start to interpret their brain processes similar to their physical processes. And I've had kids say, I can feel new connections happening in my brain. We worked with the Department of Neuroscience when I was at the University of Minnesota. We brought brains into middle schools, and we showed the kids the brain, and we taught them these things. And the kids would begin to get the sense that even if I don't get the right answer, it's like lifting weights for my brain. So that's one metaphor. Another way that the experiments have found a lot of momentum in helping kids move from a fixed to a growth mindset is through stories. They tell them stories about people like Einstein, which on one hand you'd think a lot of kids couldn't relate to, but they say he was a terrible student in elementary school. He didn't do much better in secondary school. He worked in sort of a dead-end patent job for a while before he finally found his path and became one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. Or to take another, Richard Feynman, physicist, another example, people like this who say, I wasn't a genius, I just work hard. And so when you teach kids that the brain is like a muscle, and you teach them stories about people whose lives were filled with struggle and effort more than easy accomplishment, we find that really exciting things can happen in their outcomes. So this is from one of many experiments that have been done. This was Carol Dweck and others. It was a middle school in New York City, 7th graders. And you can see at the beginning of this experiment, the 7th graders, and all of these 7th graders were students who were not succeeding academically, their GPAs were declining. And so the beginning of the experiment is time 1, and everybody's getting worse. And unfortunately, for students in middle school who are struggling in math, this decline in mathematics usually doesn't stop, and they never recover. So you can see everybody's headed in that direction. At time 2, they took that experimental group and they taught them that the brain is like a muscle. And they read stories about people like Einstein. And it was in a very, very limited number of sessions, a limited number of advisory sessions. Very importantly, the teachers who were grading the math did not know about the experiment. They didn't know what was happening to the kids in the experimental group, and they didn't know what was happening to the kids in the control group. And so what we see is that after that experiment, the kids in the experimental group, they didn't go through the ceiling, but we saw a shift in their effort, in their grades, and in their behavior. And the theory there is because there had been a reframing. From when I struggle, it means I'm stupid, to when I struggle, it means I'm getting smarter. So that's our intelligence piece. A couple more. I know this is a ton and we're moving fast. To say to a group of parents who come to a parent night and an evening in a school that community matters is in some ways a blinding flash of the obvious. Like, well, of course it matters. But I thought I would actually pick an interesting experiment that proves that in the negative. That proves that the sense of community that young people do or don't feel. And I would suggest for those of you, I just sent my oldest daughter off to college this year. For those of you, especially in high school, who are starting to think about higher ed, think hard about the community that your son or daughter might be experiencing, not just the programs. So this was a really interesting experiment that proves that community ties to educational performance also in the negative. This is where one of those points where I sort of start to feel some of these psychologists sit around and are kind of sadistic and thinking about ways they can mess with people's minds. So they brought a bunch of college undergraduates together and they told them, you're going to participate in a study of personality and educational outcomes. So that was the explicit intention of the experiment. That's what everybody thought they were going to do. Each participant completed a personality questionnaire that actually is an existing personality questionnaire that gets used around the country. So it seemed quite valid, and it was valid. But then after they completed the questionnaire, which was similar for everybody, the same for everybody, they were put into one of 3 groups, randomly assigned. After they completed the questionnaire, all of the participants went to sit down with an experimenter, somebody who was participating in the experiment, to get some feedback. The first group, randomly assigned, was called the future belonging condition. And they were told, you're the type who has rewarding relationships throughout life. You're likely to have a long and stable marriage and have friendships that'll last into your later years. The odds are that you'll always have friends and people who care about you. Now, they didn't read that. They worked it in a relatively natural way, and they mixed it in with the other feedback that the person was getting from the personality questionnaire. And the other feedback was very accurate. It was based on an actual personality questionnaire, like if some of you have taken Myers-Briggs. So if the person was an extrovert or an introvert, it all seemed very accurate. This was entirely faked. This was entirely part of the experiment. So the first group was told, you are going to belong. The second group was told, you're the type who will end up alone later in life. You may have friends and relationships now, but by your mid-20s, most of these will have drifted away. You may even marry and have several marriages, but these are likely to be short-lived and not continue into your 30s. Relationships don't last, and when you're past the age where people are constantly forming new relationships, the odds are you'll end up being alone more and more. I did not edit that at all from the study. So they knew they couldn't just have a belonging condition and an alone condition. So they did create a third condition that they mixed into the personality results. Remember, this is all part of you're sitting down to get your results, and then they weave this point in. So the third point that they weaved in was called the misfortune control condition. You're likely to be accident prone later in life. You might break an arm or leg a few times, or maybe be injured in a few car accidents. Even if you haven't been accident prone before, these things will show up later in life, and the odds are you'll have a lot of accidents. So, what happened with these three things? The participants first were asked to rate their mood because they realized that they could simply be measuring for did we depress the hell out of some people and not the others. So they all had to rate their mood on a short mood questionnaire. And then they went in and they took the general mental abilities test, a pretty standard logic test. That is a pre-existing test. So everybody took that assessment. In the future belonging condition, I should say that they found that mood did not seem to correlate with the outcomes they got on this test. So it wasn't just that the belonging people were happy and the alone people were sad. They had happy people and unhappy people in all groups. The future belonging condition, average score, 82%. Misfortune control condition, 82%. Future alone condition, 69%. This is from a very short little intervention. And here's what the researchers concluded, and here's the big point for your thinking about your young son or daughter and their sense of belonging. Social exclusion impairs controlled processes as by monopolizing some of the resources of the self's executive function. In other words, when you feel excluded, you can't think well because your mental energy is diverted to feeling excluded and dealing with the feeling of being excluded. This is not fluff, folks. And the degree to which our schools don't invest at times in creating a sense of belonging among all kids has very real implications for their performance. So that's kind of proving the point that community matters in the negative. Let me give you a quick example of how community can matter in the positive before we hit our last 2 points. It's yet another of these psychological experiments. Walton and Cohen actually reprised a classic experiment from the early 1980s, and this one is really interesting, where they wanted to deal with the fact that we have got very low college completion rates in the US. It's a big challenge for those of you who are in higher education. It's a big concern about why we don't have all young people finish college. And so what they did was they showed all freshmen at a four-year university, videos, and the key message that they wanted to communicate through these videos is, I felt that I didn't belong, but that everybody feels like they don't belong. So the freshmen came in and they all watched videos of older students talking about their time at that university. Now, some of the students said, let me stop there. Some of the students just watched videos of older students saying, I did these things on the campus, I went here, I majored in this, it was great. The experimental group, the group that is the focus of the study, heard about the stuff and where I ate and what activities I did and what classes I did, but they received that critical treatment message, which was, at first I thought I didn't belong here, and it was really hard, and then I realized that everybody feels like they don't belong here, and I found my way by making connections and sticking to it. So the simple message that was injected there that tried to reframe when a kid gets a low grade, when a kid has a discouraging comment made to them in a dining hall, when a professor makes a comment that doesn't fit, when they don't understand something in class. Instead of confirming in their mind, I don't belong here, they interpreted it as, everybody goes through that. It's part of getting used to college. So the particular group that the scholars were really focused on were the African American students in this study, but I think the findings hold in many other cases as well. They found that the black students' grades got better not just the first semester after they participated, the ones who had the treatment message, but they lasted for 3 years, and by the end of their college experience, the black-white achievement gap had been cut in half. And there were African American students in the control group as well. What was really interesting was that the researchers went back at the end of college and interviewed the students and said, do you remember those videos? And a majority of the students did not remember the content of the videos. The message had been so subtle that the particular message was lost because it had probably been confirmed by subsequent experience. When they struggled, when things didn't work out well, rather than confirming that I don't belong here, it seemed to be part of what it takes to get used to succeeding here. So even if kids have got a growth mindset, even if kids have got a sense of community, a lot of kids really, really struggle when they hit a setback. And the other thing that's exciting about some of this recent research in psychology is that there are very practical things we can do to help young people persist on the path to completing goals. And here we're really talking about not goals that take years or that take days, but goals that take weeks or months. So intermediate goals. And the technique that I am going to describe for you now, I know I'm moving at a real clip here, really briefly, which goes by the worst possible name ever for a practical technique that you might use with your son or daughter at home. Mental contrasting with implementation intentions. It rolls off the tongue. But here's what a recent study that Angela Duckworth and some of her colleagues did concluded. The present investigation suggests that adolescents can learn relatively simple self-regulation strategies that dramatically improve their ability to attain long-term academic goals. So this is now going to be my, I don't think oversimplification, but my distillation of mental contrasting with implementation intentions. Now the interesting thing is it's a convergence of two bodies of research. One was mental contrasting and one was implementation intentions. So with mental contrasting, they've used it with adults and with college students. They did a recent study with a group of 5th graders. When they taught kids how to apply the technique, I'm going to walk you through very quickly here in a moment, to those intermediate tasks. And the goal that the kids had selected was not delusional. The goal was something that they could realistically attain. They saw that it improved not only report card grades, but also attendance and conduct. Okay, so what is it? First of all, you need to teach kids that there's basic, and you somewhat oversimplify the world. You say, okay, there's basically 3 ways people set goals in life. There's some people who focus only on the benefits of achieving a goal. If I get this, it will be fantastic, and all of these good things will happen for me. But then there's some people who focus mostly on the obstacles. I'm never going to make it there. If I don't do it, this problem is in my way, I don't have this skill set, these people aren't pulling for me. And then you suggest to kids that actually it's the people who focus on both the obstacles and the benefits together who seem to do their best in achieving the goals. And when I've done this with kids, I say, why do you think that is? And kids, high school kids, middle school kids, very clearly say, well, if you're thinking about both of them, then when you hit the obstacle, you might remember the good thing. But also, if you're thinking about the good thing, you'll be expecting the obstacle. And that's mental contrasting. You want the kid to hold the benefits of the goal concurrent with the obstacles to achieving the goal in their head. So there's a simple form, and this will be on our website, Parent Further, by the beginning of next year in an interactive way. And I've done it with this. You say to the kid, let's come up with a goal. And it's a goal that you're going to set. It's something that will take no more than a few months, but definitely a few weeks. So it's a stretch. And let's brainstorm the positives. Let's brainstorm the benefits. And you got to get specific with the kids so they have a mental image of, wow, if I do this, that'll be really good. And then you need to brainstorm the obstacles. What could get in your way to achieving this goal? So the first part there is the mental contrasting. And the last line is the implementation intentions. And what's really cool about this research is putting them together. And the implementation intentions is simple if-then statements. If this obstacle hits, then I will. And what's really important in connecting the two is not that you could brainstorm every possible if-then statement that might come in an obstacle to a kid's goal, but you're building the disposition to go into problem-solving mode. You're building the orientation that when this happens, I won't be like a deer in the headlights. I won't shut down. I won't give up. So I'll give you a couple examples. I chose one. If a kid who says, I want to get a B in math, that's the goal. And they brainstorm a few of the things. My parents are going to praise me. I might make the honor roll. I'll do better in later math classes. And then 2 obstacles that, when I actually did this with an 8th grader, I spend too much time, she didn't say Facebook, she said, you're so old, nobody does Facebook. And so she was talking about like texting, I think, but I said Facebook on this. And then she said, and the classmate distracts me in math. So that's this, for an 8th grader, that's a big existential issue, that my friend talks to me in math, but I'm struggling in math. So then what you need to do is the if-then statements, and you can see we just did one here for the second obstacle. If my friend talks to me in math, then after the class I'll tell her that I'm working hard to get a B in the semester, and I need to concentrate. If that doesn't work, I'll tell my friend that I like her so much I can't stop talking to her, so I'll ask my teacher to move my seat. Now, for a lot of us, that seems like, well, of course you'd do something like that, but we're talking about adolescents who don't have the disposition to work through, my friend's talking to me, I'm not listening to the teacher anymore, and now we're out of the game because I've missed the content. So this mental contrasting seems critical. One final point about that technique, it is so important not just to do it once. You got to touch base with the kid. You got to go back and say, have you encountered any of the obstacles? Did our solution work? If it didn't work, why didn't it work? It's part of an ongoing dialogue. All right, final one here, and then we'll move on to some others. Incentives, of course, is a gigantic term. It's everything in economics. It's a lot of stuff in psychology. In the world of perseverance in schools, there's been this huge constant debate between intrinsic incentives and extrinsic incentives. Intrinsic being something I want to do because I get genuine enjoyment from it, and extrinsic being I'm doing it for a reward or for an opportunity, not because I love doing it, but for the reward. Schools do extrinsic incentives all the time, and as parents we often do as well. In education, from littlest times, it's like the gold star you might get, or some schools are increasingly paying kids actually to take advanced placement classes, for instance, or you get fake money that you can use in a school store. The point that I thought I'd make very briefly here tonight is that the research would seem to suggest two things. Number one, if you overly invest in extrinsic incentives, if you overly invest in, you'll get an award for getting this score or this grade or ranking in this place, you will start to undermine intrinsic love of learning over time. The kid will want to do it just for the gold star. But that doesn't mean that as a parent or an educator, you need to take a purist approach. Because the research would also suggest that extrinsic incentives can get some kids in the game. That in fact, the opportunity to get the gold star or the ranking or the points or even the money can get a kid to invest effort in something that they then discover, whoa, I like it, or I can do it. And so that extrinsic incentives used to get kids engaged can actually be effective, but it's kind of like if you're giving somebody a drug, you got to be very, very careful that you're not getting them addicted. So that's kind of, I know I'm doing this very briefly so we can move on. I thought in the category of incentives, I actually discovered a novel anti-incentive that this is very much for adults, but I thought it was so interesting I thought I'd include it. So there's a website called Kick.com, and there's actually several others. This was a website created by behavioral economists at Yale, and it's to help mostly adults achieve their goals, and they created the idea of an anti-incentive. And so what thousands of people have done is write a check to a charity they hate. And if they don't attain their goal, the money goes to the charity they hate. This is like a detour from the kids stuff. I just thought it was so interesting. Although maybe you could do this with kids too. So I looked up, and this is probably about a year old, I don't know what the current ones are, I looked up the 5 biggest anti-charities on Kick.com. And it's very like politically kind of schizophrenic here. Number 5 was the Narrow Pro-Choice America Foundation. So like there's some people there who clearly were not pro-choice that didn't want to do that. But then we also had the Institute for Marriage and Public Policy, pretty traditional organization. Then we had the NRA Foundation that people were giving money to that would go to them if they didn't hit their goal. Americans United for Life was number 2, so showing that compared to number 5, they were sort of split. But the number 1 anti-charity and Kick.com, when I looked it up, was the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. So I thought that's pretty brilliant. Like, that's like, honey, I have to lose this weight or my money is going to the Bush Library. But a couple final points. On incentives, the extrinsic-intrinsic dichotomy is really important to keep in mind. The biggest incentive that the research suggests we can help kids develop is a sense of their possible selves. A positive sense of who they can be in the world, and an understanding that what they do today will deeply influence their ability to become that person in the future. And there's very cool research that a psychologist at the University of Michigan and others have done with what they call possible selves trees, where they have little kids envision who they want to be in the leaves, and they have the trunk as a mediator to get to who I want to be in the future, and the strengths that I'm going to build upon are the roots. That's with little kids. With high school kids, they've done roadmaps to the future, where the kids are mapping out who they want to be in the future, and they have key turning points, forks in the road. Do I get married or not? Do I go to college or not? All of these have shown really interesting effects with helping the kid understand that what I want to be in the future influences where I want to be today. So let me give you actually one really quick example that's actually also from Stanford. It's very close to here, that shows how a vision of the possible self can change behavior in the present. This was with virtual reality, in a virtual reality setting in which each of those helmets cost about $50,000, so it's probably not replicable in your living room. But what they did was they scanned the participants who were college students. That's a scan of an actual participant in the study. That's a face of an actual participant in the study. Then they actually made a computer representation of the participant in the study. That's his representation, his avatar. But then they also made a 70-year-old representation of the person in the study. And I know I'm rushing here at the end, but this whole point is about how a vision of the future can change behavior in the present. So here's what the experiment was. First of all, the first group walked into a virtual reality room, and they saw their avatar that was the same age as them. And when they moved, it moved. When they talked, it talked. And they had a very standard conversation with another avatar. Who are you? What do you like to do? What's your name? They did it for about 10 minutes, long enough to actually form an association with the avatar, that that's me that's talking to that person, and then they left. Group B walked in, did exactly the same thing, but the avatar that they saw was the 70-year-old self. Simple conversation, simple interchange, they left the room. After both groups left the room, they were told, you just got $1,000 and you have to spend it for one of these 4 purposes. Buy something nice for someone special, invest in a retirement fund, plan a fun and extravagant occasion, put it in a checking account. The group that saw their 70-year-old self for 10 minutes was twice as likely to spend the money on retirement. And when they replicated the experiment later with a happy 70-year-old, it was even greater. So the takeaway from that, and it really does hold with kids as well, is that when we help them envision themselves in the future and connect it to their present action, that's really the best incentive of all. So let me sum up. Focusing only on sticking to it, deferring gratification, is not ultimately going to get us to that deeper sense of perseverance, that it's the mix of the things that we've talked about in this stick-to-it framework, which is not perfect and is very much a work in progress. You don't have to do it all. Pick a lever, pick a place to start. And then I thought I would add one final point, because as we mentioned at the beginning, there will be an evaluation you'll have here tonight. We'll also send an evaluation from Search Institute. I know I've bludgeoned you with charts and graphs here, and all of us need a dose of reality, so please fill out the evaluation, because I will benefit from that as well. And I thought I'd pick one other example of why we all need a dose of reality. This is kind of an excuse to give you this really, I think, interesting little soundbite from a study in the 1990s. So US News asked 1,000 Americans, who's most likely to go to heaven? And for those of you who remember the late 90s, this is kind of dated with the people that you're going to see. So the top person was Mother Teresa, the nun in Calcutta who spent her lives helping the poor in the slums. 79% said that she was likely to go to heaven. Oprah Winfrey, 66%. Michael Jordan, who had just won an NBA championship, was 65%. Princess Diana was 60%. And showing the time, OJ got 19%, actually. But here's the reason that I think that I really invite your candid evaluation of this session, because we all have these slightly warped senses of ourselves. The number one person in 1997 that Americans said would go to heaven was me. Mother Teresa may have been 79%, but me was at 87%. So thank you very much for the time. This has been a ton, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Kent. That was fantastic. We have lots to think about. I want to just say, for those of you who have younger children or teenagers, this kind of research on perseverance really continues into the time when your kids are in their 20s and really going into their own lives. My own children are 23 and 27. I recently talked to a friend and she said, my kids are 15. Oh, I have two teenagers. They're 15 and 21. Well, you know what I mean. So again, this kind of research is really important for those of us as we help launch our students into their real lives. So we are very lucky to have tonight on our panel with us Jenna Carson from Menlo Atherton. Jenna is a teacher here at MA who has worn an incredible number of hats. But before I introduce her, I want to tell you that if you have questions and would like to write on a note card, we have Paul at the left here, and Shari, are you someplace on the right? Anybody who wants a note card, here she is. Just raise your hand and we'll bring you one. We have a few questions ready from parents that our moderator will be talking about, so feel free to write and then ask them to collect, okay? So, Jenna earned her BA in mathematics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her teaching credential from San Francisco State. After 4 years of teaching middle school in the Hunters Point area of San Francisco, Jenna arrived at Menlo Atherton in 1997. Over the past 17 years, Jenna has worn many hats and worked with all ages and demographic groups that help make MA really such a special school. Some of these jobs include, and this is amazing, the diversity, classroom math teacher from remedial to honors level, student activities director, WASC chairman, professional development leader, Compass coordinator, teacher trainer and mentor, varsity soccer coach, high school transition specialist, and SDMSC vice chair. Along the way, she got married, had 3 kids, and earned a master's in educational policy from Stanford University. Her current position allows her for release time from the classroom in order to support high-risk 9th graders, and has the amazing title of Aspirations Advocate. So, thank you, Jenna. Okay. All right. So, moderating our Q&A tonight is my friend and colleague Lisa Medoff. Lisa is a PhD, a developmental psychologist who specializes in adolescent mental health. She teaches courses on adolescent development in the program in human biology at Stanford University. My daughter took a class from her in adolescent sexuality. I never heard the end of it. Where she is the School of Medicine's learning specialist. Lisa is the research and education consultant for Acknowledge Alliance, formerly the Cleo Ulau Center, where she provides workshops and trainings on social and emotional issues in the classroom. She also works privately with students who have learning disabilities and emotional disorders, and consults with families and schools to provide optimal home and school environments for kids with special needs. Her books include the Stressed Out Student's Guide to series and Resilience in the Classroom, helping students with special needs. Welcome our moderator, Lisa Medoff.
Thank you. So, wow, Jenna, I wish all schools had an aspirations advocate. That sounds like the best position in the whole world. And Kent, this is the second time I've heard you speak in a couple months. And again, I just want to thank you for your practical and I think very manageable advice. So thank you for that. So, you also reminded me, I think this is really good timing for me to think about these things, because I do pre-major advising at Stanford, so all of our incoming students are assigned to a professor or a staff member, and we have a group of 5 or 6 students that we make connections to, and we get training about how important it is that one of the number one things is to make sure that they feel like they belong. So that research really resonates with me. So I have a few questions that have been pre-submitted, and then Charlene and some of the other helpers will pass me questions as we go along. So So the first question I have here is, I have two kids. One is interested in everything, capital letters, and the other is interested in nothing. We've offered the second child all the same opportunities and encouragement as the older child, and there's been nothing that lights his fire or be his spark. What are we doing wrong, or what can we do differently? And I will, while they're deciding.
Yeah, well, I don't want to, God knows you've heard enough from me. This is so common, it's unbelievable. Somebody, I mean, there probably are 9 books on this, but this sibling difference around motivation, my allergist has this, and he, you know, they see you for like 5 seconds, and he said, well, tell me what you do for a living. And I started talking about this 20 minutes later about the same exact issue. I'm trying to finally leave the office. There, of course, and I don't think the questioner expected a sort of simple answer, but the work that we're doing, because our work at Search Institute is all about translating into practice, the research would suggest just 2 questions to ask. One, how much have you talked with the, let's just say right now, seemingly less motivated student about why aren't you like the other? Because if you've posed it in that frame, then we're not doing what really back to foundational developmental psychology would seem as essential, which is seeing the other kid as an individual. Though it is entirely rational as a parent to be saying, why aren't you like your older brother or younger brother or whatever? So one would be if you're actually parenting by comparison, that would be the other one thing. The second would be actually to try and unpack the things that we've tried to distill in this stick-to-it framework and really say, be in listening mode around each of those. And so does that individual, does the son or daughter who seems to be less motivated, do they really not have a spark? Or is it not a spark that you're necessarily celebrating or gravitating toward? So to have a very neutral conversation about the spark. I'll never forget when I was doing a day with administrators outside New York City in a school district there. I was on Perseverance, and we spent much more time, in fact today we didn't do anything around sparks. We spent a lot of time on sparks, and there was a guy who raised his hand and he said, here's my problem. Here's my son's spark, being a Rastafarian. All he wants to do is be a Rasta in his life. What is that? You can't get a job as that. All he does is comes home and wants to listen to Bob Marley, and he wants to grow dreads and do whatever. And what do I do about that? And my first response was, don't try and snuff out the spark. Unpack the spark. What is it about Rastafarianism that is animating that kid? So I'm just picking out sparks. So I think those would be the 2 things I would say is, ask yourself if you've been contrasting the 2 kids, and it's not that that's wrong, but it may not be making this kid feel seen, the kid who seems less motivated. And then look at those components of that stick-to-it framework, and just be in listening mode as cleanly as you can be across those different domains of the framework, so that you actually can try and start to hear where the motivation might lie. I would say approach that kid from the perspective not that you have no batteries included, but that you have them, and for some reason they're not animating motion yet. And so what do we need to do to make that happen?
Jenna?
Thanks. I think if you've already reflected on not doing the comparisons, right, and especially if the children are still younger, one thing I would say is be patient. Sometimes it will take them longer. And then I will also say be deliberate. So make choices around different activities that you could try. Make sure they're sticking through an activity for an entire season or designated term that's been designed. If they didn't absolutely hate it, maybe try it again, right? Maybe it's not a spark yet, but it's like an average, right? So the students I'm working with, some of them now in 9th grade, the first question I'm asking is, well, what do you love? What's your dream? Or what's your current interest? And today I had a student just stare blankly at me. right? And I said, it's okay right now, you can put an X. That's what we're gonna work on. We're gonna work on it, because if you have no current interest, you're right. But I'm gonna be patient. I think I'm gonna be patient, and I'm gonna be deliberate.
The one thing I would add too about the point about try and listen to the kid. The other thing, last time I was here, we talked about our current research on developmental relationships, and as a parent, this is very hard to admit, and I say that from experience. You may not be the person who can unpack that kid's spark, that kid's sense of possible self, but don't therefore not knock at that door. There are other adults, and maybe even other young people, but there may be other adults you can bring in to say, look, I'm not getting connected here. Are there ways that you can connect with my son or daughter to help me think this through? It's very humbling to say as a parent, but sometimes, for lots of reasons, you're not the person who can unlock that. But ultimately, you're the most influential person in that kid's life, and so you're not giving up your parental role, but you're bringing in somebody who may be able to ask those questions from a less loaded perspective.
So you each touched on something in your answer that relates to a couple of different questions. So I'm going to start with one and then move on to the other. So this is jumping off of Kent's mention of Rastafarian and love. I've got a couple questions here about video games. So one of the questions says, what if what your child's spark is seems sort of dead end or hopeless to you? For example, if the child's goal is to be a video game top contender, and you as a parent feels like it's a dead end, it's hopeless, not a lot of possibility, but also the time that they're spending on video games seems to be incredibly unhealthy. And then I've got two other similar questions there about children who want to play video games in their spare time. They're doing okay academically, but parents feel like they could do a little bit better, and what can you do to spark them or motivate them a little bit more? So solve the video game question for us in 2 minutes here.
Okay, well, first I'll wear my teacher hat. And as a teacher, I think the general message would be, remember that you're the parent. And ultimately, if you want to turn off the video games, that is one of the most powerful disciplinary strategies you have as a parent of a teenager. And that's my teacher MA answer. Now I'm going to speak as a parent. My oldest is 13 now, and I did read the book Spark, and as I read it was awesome for me because my oldest is very athletic, and if you know, my husband's a coach here as well, so we do all kinds of sports around here, and it's great, and he is going to be in the NBA, which is great, except that he's going to be 5'11" and white. So that's really, so of course I'm going to nurture that, but reading Spark reminded me of what other opportunities he could be, right? He also loves statistics. He loves baseball cards. So he loves the play-by-play and the color commentary of games. So we started talking about other options related to sports that are right up his alley, right? That he might do. He might be a statistician. He might do those other kinds of avenues that having that love and passion for sports. Yes, ultimately he will not go to the NBA, but he very possibly in the rest of his life will work in sports. So I think as a parent of the video gamer, that's maybe a direction I would take. We live right next to Redwood City's EA Sports. There are opportunities to be testers. We have computer programming here at Menlo Atherton. Our video production department is phenomenal, right? So maybe, again, when we talk unpacking, look at our electives and say, well, let's create a video game, not just play it.
That's a fantastic answer. I would say the research on motivation and technology is just starting to explode. And so it's not that there's none, but I think we're going to learn a ton more. I have a 13-year-old son who fits exactly in that category. I would say I agree completely that those are great steps. 3 points. One, game designers have thought so much more deeply about motivation than educators. It's stunning. A fundamental principle of great game design is that the core objective of the game is very easy, ideally instantaneous to understand. Oh, I'm trying to get the people to the top of the mountain, or I'm trying to kill the people in blue shirt. So the objective is obvious, but mastering the objective is endlessly complex. And in contrast, in school, a lot of times we've got kids and they have no idea what the big picture of what they're learning. Why am I learning a geometric proof? They don't know where it's, but and then they get lost in the maze. So first of all, there's something that game designers have figured a lot of this out, and we ought to just sort of, in some ways, not surrender to them, but recognize that they've thought a lot about this stuff. I think the one point I would add to the really great idea about take a look at what their spark is and look for other ways they can apply the spark is that this example is one in which that illustrates why spending time with your son or daughter on their vision of a possible self in the future is really important. And I know adolescents don't like run home and say, Mom, Dad, let's talk about my possible self, you know. So this is a heavy lift. It's kind of, but if you can actually, I mean, the basketball player example is a great one. If that's where he is, or he is, at this point, don't snuff that spark, but then you need to say, okay, if that's your vision of your possible self, 6 hours on your, DS or your phone or PlayStation or whatever is not going to get you to the NBA. And so what you're doing is you're putting that game-obsessed behavior in the context of a larger goal that the kid holds for him or herself. Now, you have to help them develop that over time. So then it's not just, this is bad for you, stop it, but is this going to get you to where you've said you want to be? So that's why that investment in a sense of possible self is not just a bunch of fluffy niceties.
Thank you. So continuing on with the sports idea, I have a couple of questions here about what do you do when your child wants to quit a sport? How do you know if they've just gotten to the point where it's gotten hard and they don't want to push through, or where they really just aren't enjoying that anymore? And so I'm going to expand that to not just encompass sports, but also to include other things. So what are some questions that you can ask yourself, or what are some signs so you know, when do I push my child, say, to stick with that really difficult class versus this is a good time to leave that environment?
I would say try and keep it short for the first time tonight, because every answer I've given has been paragraphs. Be attentive to all the stuff you're probably already thinking about, which the question alludes to, which I take under the gut of the question, yeah, maybe this isn't the right thing for the kid. Take them to some point of completion before you let them quit. Because, so for instance, what I've said, I still have that 13-year-old who loves gaming taking piano, and every year he says, I don't want to take piano. And I say, okay, but you can only quit at the end of the year in the summer after we finish a year. And he has a great piano teacher, actually. If I'd had her, I would remember something from 10 years of piano, which I don't. But then at the end of every year, I say, well, I've said you can get off the bus now. Do you want to? And he's like, well, I don't know. I think, well, you're signing on for a year. So one of the biggest things that we know from the literature on motivation is that a sense of authentic competence is profoundly motivating. So there's competence like, I did it and I love it, or there's competence, well, I got through. Yes, I did it. If you let the kid quit mid-season, in a sport, for instance, you're squandering that opportunity to have him or her say, I decided that soccer isn't for me, but I finished the season. And celebrate that. Say, you stuck it out. You finished that season. And yes, we can decide now that piano or soccer or whatever is not for you, but you didn't quit on your team. You didn't quit, mid-process. You quit at a point where we can legitimately say it's a kind of a stopping point. So that's one thing to think about, I think.
Very interesting. I immediately thought of the year-round sports phenomenon that's happening much more than ever. And that makes it hard to quit at the end of the season because there's really no beginning and no end when we're year-round. And so that may be a imaginary end, right, that you set as a goal date. That said, it's important to really reflect if they've invested 6-7 years in soccer and now they're saying, I don't want to play anymore, right? And you're saying, but you have to continue. Is it your dream or theirs? If it used to be their dream and they're growing out of it, are they just burned out? Do they need a season off? Should they go back at the end of that if they wanted it again? Or I think the other piece I would say is substitute something else. Again, if we're visioning our future self, and the vision used to be, to play soccer at the university level, then we need to help them substitute another future self, right? What's going to replace that then? Okay, that's fine if we want to make that choice. What's going to fill that time? What are we going to replace that with? And the only other exception I would say in terms of the quitting is that you absolutely have a right and a responsibility to be your child's advocate if there's a toxic environment. So whether that's a coach or a teacher or another child in a situation, if it is toxic and they are being poisoned emotionally, socially, physically, then yes, you may step in right away and take care of that situation.
Thank you. So I have also a few questions on a similar topic I'll try to combine, and this refers to what Kent said earlier about when students ask, why am I learning this geometric proof? When am I ever going to use this? So the questions include things like, so how do you motivate a student who is looking at homework or looking at classwork and thinking it's irrelevant and stupid, and also I know what then happens for me sometimes where I look at the work and in my head I'm going, yeah, that does kind of seem irrelevant and stupid. And then another question along the same lines is, what advice can you offer to parents who are trying to help their children navigate tasks that, again, kind of seem like busy work or aren't necessarily there aren't classrooms or schools that are embracing some of the principles that you talked about?
No, absolutely.
No, I'm going to start on this because I am a geometry teacher and I taught geometric proofs. And I didn't like it when I was a math major in college and then learning it and teaching it. I always struggled with it. And I actually teach Algebra 1 for the last 20 years, usually to low to struggling learners. And there is nothing more irrelevant to their life than Algebra 1, I have to tell you. It is simply a college-bound gatekeeper. And in the long run, I can, say all kinds of important things, and I could create word problems that might be relevant. But, I kind of learned in the packet at the end of the incentive piece. For me, it really just captured this dynamic, because at some point you kind of go, I know it's frustrating and it doesn't seem relevant, and here we are. You need to see if you want to play on the basketball team. So do your homework, and I'm going to help you, right? And we're especially working with younger ninth graders and 9th and 10th graders. They often have figured it out by junior and senior year. At least they can play the game of school. Maybe they're dealing with teachers who might allow some, discretion or challenge to their authority. But 9th graders, you go through the motions, and that's kind of part of what school is about, unfortunately. So I didn't have anything insightful. I'm just going to say that, yeah, it's hard to be 14.
Mm-hmm. I would say that's fairly insightful.
Yeah, no, I actually think it is, and I think I would agree emphatically with that, and I simply, in an effort to make it a little shorter tonight, didn't get into the point you found in that sentence on the sheet. There's a space between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation that some psychologists have called internalized regulation, another worst name ever. But it's the basic idea that I'm willing to do stuff that I don't like to get to an outcome I want to achieve. And that helping kids understand that life is like that is a valuable thing to do. Yeah, well, and the thing that I would just add to that is that I find, it's back to that old, don't do what I say, do what I do. it's tremendously powerful to connect with kids through your lived experience in that space. So to say, you know, on my job, I do this. Like, I'm the president of Search Institute, and I actually have to do the equivalent of Algebra 1, like, in my world. Or I did it when I was your age. So that'd be the one thing. The other thing, though, I would say, going back to the point about being an advocate for your kid, if your son or daughter is coming home with word find after word find, or the counterparts to word finds in whatever subject they're teaching, that's a moment where you need to step up as a parent and say, please tell me how this is relevant to my kid's future and how it's supposed to engage a 14-year-old. And you can do that in a respectful, you know, responsible way. But your kid only gets one time through 9th grade, or, you know, algebra or 11th grade art or something. So there's a need to be an advocate. And I think a lot of parents do feel hesitant to simply say, well, I think this looks boring. But frankly, that's a very, it doesn't mean therefore it shouldn't be taught at all, but it's a respectfully posed, valid question to ask.
Great. So this is going to be the last topic, and my apologies for, I had a lot of great questions here, and I tried to pick the ones that I had as the most common or would be the most broad. So the final question is, I've got a couple here on what about kids who are struggling with something additional, something like ADHD, learning disabilities, anxiety, depression, other mental health or physical health issues. How do you negotiate perseverance with students who just are struggling with something additional?
I think it's really important. I'm actually really glad that this question came out, even though I don't have a good answer for it, because I get it. I got it the other day about young people going through trauma. Mm-hmm. The research and the work that I have talked about here tonight is really pretty focused on the attitudes and behaviors that help kids persevere through challenging academic content and similar life experiences. There's reason to think that sparks, that community, that transitions matter for more challenging circumstances, but I want to be cautious to not veer off the research and suggest that we can be as confident, for instance, that a growth mindset will help you deal with a learning disability as it will with the sense that I'm not good in a subject matter, but I don't know that we can say that from the research. So I think it's a great question. In fact, I should have said it at the outset, that we're talking here about a very important and widely experienced challenge, but that some young people facing even greater challenges may require even more intensive supports. So that's an unsatisfactory answer. We need a Search Institute to find a better answer to that question over time. I'll just say briefly, because I know the time is set, I think the research on resilience, which is somewhat, well, not somewhat, which is distinct from the research on motivation and perseverance, offers a lot of hope for young people that we're talking about, I think, in that question. And they're related bodies, but they're distinct. And I think there's a lot of reason to be looking at that. I hope there are organizations out there like Search Institute is trying to translate this research on motivation and persistence in school and in youth programs into practical solutions. I hope there are people trying to translate the research on resilience and trauma into similar solutions for kids facing more challenging circumstances, because they really need it too.
Great. Thanks, Jenna.
Well, he can't answer that because he's a researcher, but I can answer it because I've been working with high-risk teens for 20 years. And in my personal experience and professional life, I would absolutely say that these are the services and the places we need to put our energy. We are so incredibly fortunate that MA is rich in resources. And there's a reason I landed here and have no interest in going anywhere else. We have a giving community that understands the various needs of all of our different populations. and that kids come at this in so many different ways. I mean, we're able to fund Challenge Day, we fund Freshman Transition, we have orientations, we have the Compass Program and Honors Institute. We really focus on this. We have counselors on campus. Mickey Christarin is a full-time support services coordinator. She coordinates with the outside nonprofits in our area, and now they've hired me to work full-time with kids who might be struggling in that way. So I think that I would stay based in this same stuff. I think if you're experiencing that personally, I'd like you to feel comfortable in reaching out to someone at school and me directly if you want. There really are so many resources around here that I think we feel very blessed, and it makes for a great place to work with kids because they are so different and they're all interesting, and they come with so many different challenges, and ultimately this sense of community and persistence and perseverance is really what helps us be so successful in the long run.
Great. Thank you. So is there anything else that one or both of you would like to add, burning thought in your head today that you didn't get a chance because the question didn't come up, or any final words you'd like to leave us with?
I just want to thank, in addition to the Parent Association that's brought me out in search a couple times, to thank the Ting Family Foundation, who have made this possible and who are supporting other really cutting-edge research around the dynamic between kids within schools and beyond. So that's just a really important point I wanted to make. I don't know that I should have said it at the beginning, but I wanted to say it before we were done. So,
thank you. Jenna?
Just make sure you know, Jay Carson at seq.org. If you have any questions about MA, I pretty much can answer really almost anything you need to know. Jay Carson, there you go.
All right. Thank you both so much for your time and your wonderful and thoughtful answers. We really appreciate you.
So before we close and thank our wonderful presenters tonight, I want to add that we're hoping that this is a conversation opener, that this is not supposed to be a drop-in parent education series. So if you are interested, and I hope that you are, and I could tell by the people in the room tonight, let the principal know, let the administrators know that you appreciated this tonight, and we hope to bring Dr. Pekel back to address the staff at MA in the near term, and hopefully this perseverance process, something that we can continue the ball rolling at MA. So join me in thanking Jenna Carson and Kent Pekel and Lisa Medoff.